morning of July 7th, 1944, a convoy of canvas-covered trucks wound its way up the narrow mountain roads of Colorado's San Isabel National Forest, climbing to an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet above sea level. Inside the vehicles, 42 German prisoners of war sat in silence, watching the pine forests give way to rocky slopes and air so thin it burned the lungs with each breath. They had been told only that they were being assigned to a special work detail in the mountains. Some exchanged glances, filled with calculation, already measuring distances and angles of escape. Others simply stared at their hands, too exhausted by months of captivity to think beyond the next meal, the next night's sleep. But one prisoner sat differently from the rest. Lucas Reinhardt pressed himself against the truck's wooden bench, his body taking up barely more space than a child's. At 19 years old, he should have weighed 145 pounds on his 5'10" frame. Instead, he weighed exactly 94 pounds. His uniform hung on him like fabric draped over wire. His cheekbones cast shadows across a face that had forgotten what fullness meant. His hands, skeletal and trembling, gripped the bench edge not from fear, but from the simple effort of remaining upright. 3 months earlier, in a prisoner processing camp outside of New York, a doctor had written in Reinhardt's medical file, "Severe malnutrition, chronic dysentery, possible tuberculosis, prognosis poor without intervention." Reinhardt had not seen that file. He knew only that his body was failing, that each day felt like wading through deep water, that sleep brought no rest and food brought no strength. He had stopped planning for any future beyond tomorrow. Tomorrow was ambitious enough. Beside him, a different kind of man sat studying the landscape with practiced eyes. Wilhelm Adler, 27 years old. Obergefreiter in rank, had worked as a mountain guide in Bavaria before the war. He knew mountains the way sailors knew the sea, understanding their moods and dangers with an intimacy that came from years of close attention. He had served in Norway's peaks before his capture in Tunisia, and he recognized immediately what these Colorado mountains represented. Opportunity. The trucks climbed higher, the air grew thinner. Reinhardt's breathing became shallow and rapid, his damaged lungs struggling with the altitude. Adler glanced at him, once assessed him the way a guide might assess a client unlikely to reach the summit, then returned his attention to the terrain. They were not friends. They had barely spoken during the weeks of transit. But they would be connected by what happened in these mountains, bound together by choices not yet made and transformations neither could imagine. The camp they arrived at sat in a broad valley surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky with granite fingers. This was not the main facility of Camp Hale, where thousands of American mountain troops trained for alpine warfare. Instead, the trucks pulled up to a smaller outpost, a collection of wooden barracks that looked hastily constructed, practical rather than permanent. Around the buildings lay equipment that some of the prisoners recognized immediately: logging saws, axes, skidding chains, measuring tools, safety gear. An American captain stood waiting for them, a clipboard in his hands and a bearing that suggested competence rather than ceremony. Captain Garrett Sullivan was 33 years old, a forestry engineer from Oregon who had spent most of his life in timber country. He was tall and lean, with the weathered face of a man who worked outdoors in all seasons. He regarded the assembled prisoners with neither hostility nor excessive friendliness, just the practical assessment of someone sizing up a work crew. Beside him stood the interpreter, Sergeant Friedrich Weber, a German-American in his mid-30s whose family had immigrated to Pennsylvania before the Great War. Weber's role was translation, but he understood it was also mediation, building a bridge between two groups of men who had every reason to hate each other and very few reasons to trust. Through Weber's translation, Captain Sullivan explained their assignment. The United States Forest Service needed timber. Not just any timber, but specific high-quality lumber from high-altitude trees, pine and spruce, that grew strong in the thin air and harsh conditions. The prisoners would be logging these forests under American supervision, cutting and processing timber that would be used for various wartime construction needs. The work would be hard. The altitude would make everything harder, but they would be fed, clothed, housed, and treated according to the Geneva Conventions. As Sullivan spoke, Reinhardt swayed slightly, fighting to stay conscious. The combination of altitude exhaustion and months of inadequate nutrition had pushed him to the edge of collapse. An older prisoner beside him, a factory worker from Munich named Hans Vogel, steadied him with one hand. Among the 42 prisoners, Sullivan's eyes paused on Reinhardt. "You did not need medical training to see that this boy was in serious condition." Sullivan made a note on his clipboard, then continued his briefing. The prisoners were divided into barracks assignments and given the remainder of the day to settle in. As the groups dispersed, Adler moved deliberately through the crowd, making eye contact with specific men. He had been observing his fellow prisoners for weeks during transit, identifying those who might be useful, who had skills or temperaments suited for what he was already planning. By evening, he had selected 5 men besides himself. Franz Bergmann, 30 years old, a forester from Bavaria who understood trees and terrain. Bergmann had a wife and a 6-year-old son waiting for him back home, a detail he mentioned to no one, but that shaped every calculation he made about survival and return. Werner Brandt, 23, a university student of economics from Hamburg who could think strategically and calculate odds. Oskar Schilling, 25, a farm boy from Saxony who could navigate by stars and read weather in the sky. And 2 brothers, Emil and Jakob Hartmann, aged 22 and 20, who had grown up hiking the Alps and could climb anything. These 5 Adler decided were capable of what he had in mind. There was a 6th man he considered but did not yet approach. Lucas Reinhardt was too weak now to be useful, but Reinhardt had been an apprentice pharmacist before conscription, which meant knowledge of medicines, dosages, treatment of injuries. If Reinhardt survived long enough to regain strength, those skills might prove valuable. If he survived. That night, Reinhardt lay on his bunk, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. His body ached with a deep pain that had become so constant he barely noticed it anymore. His stomach cramped from hunger, even though he had eaten. Malnutrition had damaged his digestive system so severely that food often caused as much discomfort as starvation. He thought about his mother in Hamburg. Her last letter, received 5 months ago before his capture, had been brief. "We have ration cards for 1,200 calories per day. Your father grows thin but continues his work clearing rubble. We manage with what we have. We pray for you always." 1,200 calories. In a city that had already been bombed repeatedly. For his mother, his father, his younger sister, Anna. And here he was, an ocean away, too weak to help them, too damaged to even help himself. He did not know if they were alive or dead. The letters had stopped. There was no way to know. Sleep eventually came, but it brought no rest. The next morning began with a revelation that would shake Reinhardt more profoundly than enemy fire ever had. At 6 o'clock, the prisoners were roused and led to a mess hall that smelled of wood smoke and cooking grease. They filed in, expecting the thin soup and hard bread that had been standard in every camp before this. Instead, they found themselves standing in front of a serving line where American cooks were dishing out food from steaming pots and griddles. Reinhardt took the metal tray he was handed and moved through the line in a daze. The first cook placed 4 strips of bacon on his tray. Not thin rationed scraps, but thick-cut strips glistening with rendered fat, the edges crispy and dark, the centers still showing the white marbling of pure pork. Reinhardt stared. 4 strips. For 1 person. For 1 meal. The second cook added scrambled eggs, 3 whole eggs worth fluffy and yellow, clearly cooked with butter. Real butter, not margarine or lard, but actual dairy butter that left a golden sheen on the egg's surface. The third cook placed 2 slices of white bread on the tray, already toasted, with 2 pats of butter on the side. The fourth cook poured coffee into a metal cup, real coffee that smelled like coffee and not the roasted grain ersatz that Germany had been drinking for years. Beside the coffee station sat containers of cream and sugar. Reinhardt carried his tray to a table and sat down. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions, staring at their trays with expressions ranging from suspicion to disbelief to something close to grief. Hans Vogel sat down across from Reinhardt and spoke quietly in German. "Eat slowly. Your stomach has shrunk. If you eat too fast, you will be sick." Reinhardt nodded, but could not look away from the bacon. He picked up one strip. It was still hot enough to warm his fingers. He brought it close to his face and smelled it. The scent was overwhelming after months of bland, minimal food, salt and smoke, and a deep, meaty richness that seemed to fill his entire head. There was a sweetness underneath, subtle from whatever cure had been used. He bit into it. The crispy edge shattered between his teeth with an audible crunch. Then the fat inside began to melt, coating his tongue with a texture like warm silk. The salt hit first, blooming across his taste buds with an intensity that made his eyes water. Then the fat itself, rich and satisfying in a way his body had forgotten was possible. Finally, that subtle sweetness rounding out the flavors, making him want to take another bite before he had finished swallowing the first. He chewed slowly, exactly as Vogel had instructed, but it was agony to go slow. His body was screaming for him to devour everything on the tray immediately, to consume every calorie while it was available, because his animal brain did not trust that there would be more tomorrow. The eggs came next. Creamy and rich, they coated his throat going down. The butter added another layer of fat, another dimension of richness. The toast, soft inside and crispy outside, soaked up the egg residue and butter until each bite was a combination of textures and temperatures. The coffee, when he finally tried it, was bitter and hot, and absolutely real. The cream softened the bitterness. The sugar added a sweetness that made the whole cup taste like luxury itself. Reinhardt ate everything on his tray. It took him 20 minutes because Vogel kept reminding him to go slowly. When he finished, he felt simultaneously more satisfied than he had in months, and violently nauseated from the richness. He made it outside before vomiting behind the barracks. Vogel followed him out and waited until he was done. "It will be like this for a few days. Your body is not used to real food, but it will adjust." Reinhardt wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He was shaking, and not just from the vomiting. "How many calories do you think that was?" Vogel shrugged. 700 perhaps, just for breakfast. My mother's ration card is 1,200 for the entire day." Vogel had no answer to that. Reinhardt straightened up his skeletal frame, trembling with more than physical weakness. "I just ate half of my mother's daily ration in one meal, and I threw it up." "Your mother would want you to eat," Vogel said quietly. "Would she?" Reinhardt's voice carried a bitterness that aged him beyond his 19 years. "If she knew I was eating bacon while she boils potato peels, would she really want that? Or would she think I had betrayed everything?" Vogel looked at the younger man for a long moment. "I think she would want you to survive, whatever it takes." They stood in silence while other prisoners filed past to the work assignments. Later that morning, Reinhardt was called to the camp's medical building. A sign outside identified it as the clinic, and inside he found a man in his late 40s wearing the insignia of a captain and the bearing of someone who had spent more time with livestock than with soldiers. "I'm Dr. Warren Blackwell," the man said through Sergeant Weber's translation. "I was a ranch doctor in Wyoming before all this. Sit down." Reinhardt sat. Blackwell examined him with practiced efficiency, listening to his lungs, checking his pulse, palpating his abdomen, looking into his eyes and throat. He weighed him on a scale and recorded the number 94 pounds. "How tall are you?" Blackwell asked. 5'10", sir." Blackwell did some mental calculation and shook his head. "You should weigh about 145 pounds. You're 51 pounds underweight. That's not malnutrition. That's starvation." Through Weber, they discussed Reinhardt's medical history, the dysentery that had plagued him for months, the chronic cough that might be tuberculosis or might just be damage from malnutrition, the fact that he had not had a solid bowel movement in weeks. Blackwell made notes on a chart, then looked at Reinhardt directly.
You're in bad shape, son. But you're young, and young men can recover from things that would kill older folks. I'm putting you on a special feeding protocol."
Over the next hour, Blackwell explained what that meant. Reinhardt was one of 8 prisoners who were severely malnourished. They would be fed separately from the others at first, with careful attention to caloric intake and nutritional balance. Too much food, too fast, could be dangerous after prolonged starvation. They would start at 2,000 calories per day and gradually increase. "We'll weigh you every day," Blackwell said. "Track your progress, make adjustments as needed." "Why?" The question came out before Reinhardt could stop it. Blackwell paused. "Why what? Why do you care if I gain weight? I am a prisoner, an enemy." Blackwell studied him for a moment, then spoke slowly while Weber translated. "Because you're somebody's son, and because I'm a doctor. Taking care of people is what I do. War doesn't change that." Reinhardt had no response to this. Over the following days, a routine established itself. The severely malnourished prisoners, including Reinhardt, were separated from the general work crews. While the others went into the forest to begin logging operations, Reinhardt and 7 others remained in camp, doing light duties, organizing equipment, cleaning barracks, helping in the kitchen. They were fed 4 times a day instead of 3. Breakfast remained bacon and eggs. Lunch was soup, but thick soup with meat and vegetables accompanied by bread and butter. Dinner was a rotation of beef stew, pork chops, chicken and potatoes. There was a snack before bed, usually bread and cheese or fruit when available. Every morning, Reinhardt reported to Dr. Blackwell's clinic to be weighed. The doctor recorded the numbers in a ledger with Reinhardt's name at the top. Day 1, 94 pounds. Day 2, 94 pounds. Day 3, 95 pounds. Day 4, 96 pounds. Day 5, 97 pounds. Day 6, 98 pounds. Day 7, 98 pounds. After 1 week, Blackwell reviewed the numbers and nodded with satisfaction. 4 pounds in 7 days. That's good progress. We're going to increase your calories to 2,500 starting tomorrow." Reinhardt looked at the weight chart, at the careful handwriting tracking his slow return from the edge of death. "I do not understand this." "What don't you understand?" "In the camps before this, the food was enough to keep us alive but not healthy, just enough to work but not thrive. This is different. You are trying to make me healthy." Blackwell closed the ledger. "That's right. But why healthy prisoners are more dangerous, more able to escape or resist?" The doctor smiled slightly. "Son, you couldn't escape right now if we left the gates open and gave you a head start. You can barely walk 2 miles without needing to rest. And as for resistance, well, prisoners who are treated decently tend to cause less trouble than prisoners who are treated badly." Turns out kindness is pretty good security. This logic was so foreign to everything Reinhardt had been taught about how nations conducted themselves during war that he could not process it. He simply nodded and left the clinic, his mind churning with questions he did not have the English to ask. Meanwhile, in the forest, the main work crews were learning what logging in the American West actually meant. Captain Sullivan led them into stands of pine and spruce that had been growing for decades, some for over a century. But they were not there to clear cut, which would have been faster and more efficient for pure lumber production. Instead, Sullivan taught them selective logging. Through Sergeant Weber's translation, he explained the philosophy. They would take mature trees, the ones that had reached their full growth and would not grow much larger. They would leave younger trees, saplings and mid-growth timber that still had decades of development ahead. By removing the largest trees, they would create gaps in the canopy that allowed sunlight to reach the forest floor, helping the younger growth. This was forest management, not just resource extraction. Wilhelm Adler listened to this explanation with growing interest. He had worked in forests all his life, but always with a focus on getting timber out as efficiently as possible. This American approach was different. It assumed the forest would be there for generations. It assumed there would be a future beyond the war, beyond the current need for lumber. It assumed victory so confidently that it could plan for peacetime while still fighting. Franz Bergmann, the Bavarian forester, was equally struck by the methodology. He asked questions through Weber, and Sullivan answered them in detail. How did they determine which trees to take? What spacing did they maintain? How did they handle replanting in the cleared areas? Sullivan explained each decision, treating their questions with the respect he would give to professional colleagues, not enemy prisoners. As Bergman listened, he thought about his 6-year-old son back in Bavaria, about the forests the boy might walk through someday if those forests survived the war. The idea that you could cut timber while planning for your grandchildren's grandchildren to do the same was radical. It suggested a future beyond the current destruction. The work itself was brutal, physical labor at altitude that left even fit men gasping. The thin air made every task twice as difficult as it would have been at sea level. Swinging an axe, pulling a saw, dragging cut timber, all of it burned the lungs and exhausted the muscles. But the equipment they were given was excellent. The saws were sharp, recently manufactured with replacement blades available when needed. The safety equipment was comprehensive goggles, gloves, boots with proper tread for mountain terrain. When a tool broke or wore out, it was replaced without complaint. Otto Dietrich, a hardcore National Socialist true believer who had been a regional party official before the war, muttered to his companions that this was American waste, careless abundance that would ultimately be their downfall. But Werner Brandt, the economics student, was not so sure. That evening, Adler gathered his selected group in a corner of the barracks after the count. Besides himself, there were the 5 he had identified: Bergman, the forester, Brandt, the student, Schilling, the farm boy, and the Hartmann brothers. "I want you to think about something," Adler said quietly in German. "Look at this camp. Look at the food, the equipment, the way they organize the work. What does it tell you?" Brandt spoke first. "It tells me they have resources we do not. More than I believed possible." "Be specific." Brandt thought for a moment. "In my economics courses, we studied American industrial capacity. The numbers seemed impossible. We were taught they were propaganda exaggerations meant to demoralize us. But this camp, these conditions, they suggest those numbers were accurate, perhaps even conservative." Emil Hartmann, the younger brother, asked the question they were all thinking. "Are you planning what I think you are planning?" Adler smiled slightly. "We are in the mountains, remote, lightly guarded. What would you expect someone in my position to be planning?" "Escape," Jakob Hartmann said. "Escape," Adler confirmed. "But not yet. We need time to prepare, to learn the terrain, to wait for the right conditions. I am thinking late August, new moon, after we have built up our strength and knowledge." Bergman nodded slowly. "The forest extends for hundreds of miles. A man could disappear and could—" "6 men could disappear," Adler corrected. "I want you 5 with me. You have the skills we will need. Bergman knows forests. Brandt can plan and calculate. Schilling can navigate. The Hartmann brothers can handle difficult terrain." They looked at each other, seeing in their companions' faces the same calculation they felt themselves, the same desire for freedom, the same determination to not remain captive. "There is a 6th person I am considering," Adler said. "The pharmacist boy, Reinhardt." "He is half dead," Emil said. "He would slow us down." "Now, yes, but in 6 weeks, if the Americans continue feeding him the way they are, he might be strong enough, and his knowledge of medicine could be valuable if one of us is injured." Brandt raised a practical concern. "If he gains weight, if he becomes healthy, will he still want to escape? Will any of us?" It was a dangerous question, one that touched on something they all felt but did not want to acknowledge. The food here was better than many of them had eaten in years of service. The work was hard but fair. The treatment was correct, even respectful at times. "We are soldiers," Adler said firmly. "Prisoners of war. Escape is our duty. Comfort does not change that duty." They nodded, but Brandt's question hung in the air unanswered. On the 14th day, Reinhardt stepped on Dr. Blackwell's scale and watched the needle settle at 105 pounds, 11 pounds gained in 2 weeks. Blackwell recorded the number and smiled. "Good, very good. I think you are ready to start light work in the forest. Nothing heavy.
You will be on the measuring crew with Sergeant Wade. He will take care of you."
That afternoon, Reinhardt met Sergeant Clayton Wade for the first time. Wade was 51 years old, with the weathered face and lean build of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life. He had a slight limp from a wound received in the Great War, and he moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body had been used hard and was making its protests known. "You are the pharmacist?" Wade asked through Weber's translation. "I was an apprentice, yes, sir." "Well, apprentice pharmacist, your job is to help me mark trees for cutting. Captain Sullivan picks which ones you and I paint the marks. No heavy lifting, just walking and painting. Can you manage that?" "I think so, sir." "Call me Wade. Everyone does." They walked into the forest together, Wade carrying the paint and brushes, Reinhardt carrying a notebook to record which trees were marked. The pace was slow, accommodating both Wade's limp and Reinhardt's weakness, but neither man acknowledged this fact. As they worked, Wade talked, not asking questions or demanding conversation, just filling the silence with words the way men do when working together. He talked about Montana, about the ranch where he had raised cattle for 30 years, about the mountains there, different from these but equally beautiful, about his 3 sons, Patrick, Matthew, and Thomas. Patrick, 27, was in the Marines fighting in the Pacific. Matthew, 24, was with the Army in Europe. Thomas, the youngest, just 19, was in the Army Air Corps training to be a bombardier. 3 boys, Wade said, all in uniform, all in harm's way. You know what that does to a father. Reinhardt shook his head. It makes you think about sons, about young men who are somebody's boys no matter which uniform they wear. They painted trees in silence for a while. Then Wade asked, "How old are you?" 19, sir. Wade. Same as Thomas. You were conscripted? Yes, last year. I had 6 weeks of training before Tunisia. 6 weeks? Jesus. Wade shook his head. They gave you 6 weeks to learn how to be a soldier and then sent you to Africa. That is not enough time to learn anything useful. No, sir, it was not. Well, Wade said, at least you are here now, safe, getting healthy. Your parents must be grateful for that. Reinhardt said nothing. How could he explain the guilt that came with every meal? The feeling of betrayal that accompanied every pound he gained. Wade seemed to sense the younger man's discomfort and changed the subject, returning to stories about Montana, about horses and cattle and winters so cold the snow squeaked underfoot. Nearby, Franz Bergman was working with his own crew, cutting a large spruce. He overheard Wade mention his sons and thought about his own boy back in Bavaria, 6 years old now. Would he even recognize his father when the war ended? The question haunted him every night. Over the following days, Reinhardt's routine expanded. Mornings with Dr. Blackwell for weighing, days in the forest with Wade marking trees. Evenings learning English from Weber, who offered informal lessons to any prisoner interested. The weight continued to climb. Day 21, 112 pounds. 18 pounds gained. Blackwell upgraded his status to cleared for light work and increased his caloric intake to 3,000 per day. Reinhardt could feel his body changing. His face filled out slightly. His ribs, which had been visible through his skin, began to disappear under a thin layer of fat and muscle. He could walk farther without needing rest. His cough diminished. He was returning to life, and it felt like a betrayal of everyone he had left behind. In the 4th week, something happened that would begin to crack the certainty that all 6 of Adler's group felt about their planned escape. They were working on a ridge cutting a mature spruce that Sullivan had marked for harvesting. The Hartman brothers were handling a 2-man saw while the others prepared the fall zone and planned the skidding route. Captain Sullivan was 30 feet away, marking the next tree in the sequence. The spruce was old, perhaps 80 years of growth, and it had some dead wood high in its canopy. A widowmaker, loggers called it. A branch already dead but still attached, waiting for vibration or wind to send it falling. As the saw bit deeper into the trunk, the tree began to shift. This was normal, the expected lean before the fall. But the movement dislodged something high above. 200 pounds of dead wood, a branch as thick as a man's thigh broke free from the crown and plummeted straight down, directly toward Emil Hartmann's head. Sullivan saw it before anyone else. He was too far away to reach Emil in time, but he shouted anyway, a wordless warning cry, and then he was running. Emil looked up at the sound, saw the branch falling, and froze. Fear locked his muscles. In that half-second of paralysis, the branch closed the distance. Sullivan covered 30 feet in perhaps 2 seconds, moving with the desperate speed of someone who has already watched too many people die and cannot bear to see another. He hit Emil with his shoulder, a solid tackle that sent both men sprawling sideways into the underbrush. The Widowmaker crashed down exactly where Emil had been standing. It hit with enough force to drive 6 inches into the soft forest floor. For a moment, no one moved. Then Emil scrambled to his feet, staring at the branch that would have killed him, at Captain Sullivan, who was picking himself up and brushing pine needles off his uniform. "You all right?" Sullivan asked. Emil nodded, unable to speak. Sullivan examined the branch, judged it to no longer be a threat, then returned to his tree marking as if nothing unusual had occurred. That evening, Emil described the incident to his brother Jakob in rapid, shaken German. "He was 30 feet away. He had no reason to care if I lived or died. But he ran. He saved me." Jakob listened without interrupting. When his brother finished, he said quietly, "We are planning to escape from people who just saved your life." "I know. Does that not trouble you?" Emil had no good answer. The incident reached the other members of Adler's group through the camp's informal network of conversation. Each man processed it differently. Bergman thought about the physics of Sullivan's reaction time, the split-second decision to value a prisoner's life over his own safety. He thought about his son in Bavaria and wondered if someone would make that same choice for the boy if he were ever in danger. Brandt thought about what kind of system produced officers who would make such decisions, what kind of training or culture or philosophy led to that moment of selfless action. Schilling thought about duty and honor, and whether those concepts meant the same thing to Americans as they did to Germans. Adler thought about how this single incident had introduced doubt into a plan that required absolute commitment. And Reinhardt, when he heard about it from Wade the next day, thought about Sergeant Wade's earlier words, "You are somebody's son." It seemed that Captain Sullivan believed that too. On the morning of August 15th, 6 weeks after their arrival, a summer storm rolled in from the west faster than anyone had predicted. These mountain storms could be violent, bringing lightning, hail, torrential rain, and dangerous temperature drops in a matter of minutes. Captain Sullivan, who had spent enough time in these mountains to respect their weather, immediately ordered all work crews back to camp. The prisoners began the hike down from their various locations, moving quickly but carefully on trails that were already turning slick with rain. One crew did not make it back before the storm hit in full force. Wilhelm Adler, Franz Bergman, and Lucas Reinhardt, along with Sergeant Clayton Wade and a younger guard named Private Davis, found themselves caught on an exposed ridge when the storm transformed from threatening to dangerous. Rain lashed horizontally, driven by winds that made standing difficult. Visibility dropped to a few dozen feet. Lightning struck close enough that the thunder was instantaneous, a physical force that left ears ringing. Wade made a quick assessment of their situation. They were 2 miles from camp, but only about 1 mile from a Forest Service cabin. He knew of a small shelter maintained for emergency use. The cabin was closer and would provide better protection than trying to make it back in these conditions. He shouted over the storm's roar, "Follow me! Stay close!" They moved in single file, Wade leading Davis at the rear, the 3 prisoners between them. The trail had become a stream. Every step was uncertain. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and they were all soaked through, which meant hypothermia was a real and immediate danger even in August. Reinhardt, still not fully recovered, despite his weight gain, struggled to keep pace. His lungs burned. His legs shook with effort. But Bergman stayed behind him occasionally, steadying him with a hand when he slipped, and somehow he kept moving. After 45 minutes that felt like hours, Wade led them to a small wooden structure barely visible through the rain. The Forest Service cabin was basic but solid, built to withstand mountain weather. Wade got the door open and they stumbled inside. The interior was a single room with a wood stove, some bunks, a table, and supplies stored in sealed containers. Wade immediately began building a fire in the stove, while Davis checked the supplies and found coffee, canned goods, blankets. "Strip off your wet outer layers," Wade ordered. "Wrap in blankets. We wait here until the storm passes." They obeyed, pragmatism overriding any modesty. Soon they were huddled around the stove as it began to radiate heat into the small space. Wade found a metal coffee pot, filled it with water from a sealed jug, and set it on the stove to boil. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, 5 men who should have been enemies sat in uneasy silence, united temporarily by the need to survive nature's indifference. Wade got the coffee brewing, then settled onto a bench with a blanket around his shoulders. The waiting began. After perhaps 30 minutes of silence, broken only by the storm's fury, Wade began to talk. Wade talked the way men do when trapped by weather and circumstance, filling the silence with stories, because silence in such close quarters becomes its own kind of pressure. He spoke in English slowly enough that the prisoners could catch some words, and occasionally Bergman would translate the parts that Reinhardt and Adler missed. He told them about his grandfather, who had come from Scotland in the 1880s with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to build something from American dirt. How the old man had worked railroad construction for 5 years, saving every penny until he had enough to file a homestead claim in Montana. How he had broken that land with his own hands, lived in a sod house the first winter, nearly starved the second winter, and by the third winter had a cabin and 20 head of cattle. He used to say, Wade continued, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion, that America did not care where you came from or who your father was, only cared what you could build with your own 2 hands. I grew up believing that, built my life on that idea. He paused to pour coffee into a single metal cup and passed it to Adler, who took a sip and passed it to Bergman. They shared it among the 5 of them, the gesture unconscious but significant. Wade told them about the Depression years when cattle prices collapsed and the ranch that his grandfather had built nearly failed. When his family went days eating nothing but potatoes because there was nothing else. When neighboring families simply walked away from their land because staying meant starvation. "The logging camps saved us," he said. "I spent 3 winters working timber in Idaho and Oregon. Hard work, dangerous work, but it paid wages when there was no other money to be had. Sent every dollar home to my wife so she could keep the ranch going, keep our boys fed." He talked about his sons then, and his voice changed, took on a weight that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Patrick was fighting his way across Pacific Islands. Wade could not pronounce, against an enemy that fought with a desperation Wade recognized. Matthew was somewhere in Europe, his letters heavily censored, fighting Germans who might have trained alongside these 3 prisoners. And Thomas was learning to drop bombs on the cities they were from. Wade stopped talking for a moment. Outside, lightning struck close enough to make the cabin's timbers creak. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas is learning to drop bombs on cities. On Germany. Maybe on Hamburg, or Munich, or Dresden. Cities where people like you 3 are from. Where your families still are." Reinhardt felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "Every night," Wade continued, "I pray that Patrick and Matthew come home safe. And every night I know that for them to come home safe, they have to kill people. Maybe kill fathers and sons and brothers on the other side who have families praying for them the same way I pray for mine." He looked directly at Reinhardt then. "You are 19, same age as Thomas. You were probably conscripted same as he would have been if this war had gone on another year before he enlisted. And here I am, making sure you eat enough bacon, making sure you get healthy and strong, while my son flies missions that might kill your family." The truth of it hung in the small cabin like smoke. The impossible, terrible truth that war made everyone complicit in suffering they did not want and could not prevent. Bergman was the first to speak, his voice careful. "My son is 6 years old, in Bavaria with my wife. I have not seen him in 2 years. I do not know if your Matthew or someone like him has dropped bombs on my village. I do not know if my boy still lives. Adler said quietly, I had a brother, younger. He would be 23 now. He was killed at Stalingrad. I do not even know exactly how he died, just that he died there in that frozen hell, and we could not bring his body home. They sat with that knowledge. The cabin's warmth was a small mercy in a world that offered few. Wade passed the coffee cup around again. When it reached Reinhardt, the young man held it in both hands, feeling the heat seep into his palms. He thought about his mother and father and sister Anna in Hamburg, about whether they were alive or dead, about whether American bombs had fallen on them while he ate bacon in Colorado mountains. My father, Reinhardt said slowly, his English halting but determined, works clearing bomb damage in Hamburg. Every day he digs through rubble. Maybe he finds bodies. Maybe he finds nothing. My mother and sister, they try to find food. Ration cards often do not work. Sometimes they eat potato peels, sometimes grass. He looked at Wade. And I eat bacon, 4 strips, every morning. I gain weight while they starve. I am healthy while they suffer. How do I deserve this? Wade was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Reinhardt would remember for the rest of his life. You do not deserve it, son. None of us deserve what we get in this war. Not the good and not the bad. It just happens to us. The only choice we have is what we do with it afterward. Do we use our survival to hate, or do we use it to build something better than what came before? The storm continued for another hour. They drank the coffee and shared some canned beans that Davis heated on the stove. They wrapped themselves in blankets and waited. And in that waiting, something fundamental shifted. They were still enemies by definition, still separated by uniforms and flags and the machinery of war. But in that small cabin, warmed by the same fire and threatened by the same storm, they were also simply men, fathers and sons, workers and survivors. Human beings trying to make sense of a world that had gone mad with violence. When the storm finally broke and they made their way back to camp, they found the others safe and accounted for. Captain Sullivan counted them off with visible relief. The incident was logged as a routine weather delay, but for the 3 prisoners and Sergeant Wade, something had changed that could not be logged or reported. Some barrier had been crossed in that cabin that could not be uncrossed. That night, Wilhelm Adler lay in his bunk thinking about the escape plan. It was still viable. The terrain was learnable. The guards were few and elderly. The window of opportunity would come with the new moon in 2 weeks on August 30th. But for the first time since his capture, Adler found himself questioning whether escape was actually what he wanted. The next 2 weeks unfolded with a strange tension. On the surface, everything continued normally. The prisoners logged timber under Captain Sullivan's direction. Reinhardt continued his daily weigh-ins with Dr. Blackwell, his body slowly rebuilding itself. The weight chart showed steady progress: 118 pounds, 121 pounds, 124 pounds. But beneath the routine currents of change were moving through the camp. On August 28th, 2 days before Adler's planned escape date, something happened that would force everything into the open. 2 prisoners who were not part of Adler's group, a man named Otto Dietrich and his follower Karl Roth, made their own escape attempt. They had been planning it separately, telling no one, and they chose a moment when the guards were distracted by a supply delivery to slip away into the forest. By 4 in the afternoon, their absence was noticed. Captain Sullivan immediately organized a search party, taking 4 guards and requesting volunteers from among the prisoners who knew the forest best. He looked directly at Adler's group. You men have been working these trails for 7 weeks. You know the terrain better than most of my guards. I am asking for your help. It was not quite an order, but neither was it entirely a request. Adler felt the weight of the decision press down on him. Dietrich and Roth had gone northeast toward the high country. They did not know the mountains. They were probably carrying minimal supplies. The weather forecast called for possible storms overnight. This was in fact almost exactly the plan Adler had developed for his own group. The same direction, the same timing, the same assumption that determination and luck would be enough. But Adler had spent 7 weeks learning these mountains with Bergman and the Hartmann brothers. He knew things that Dietrich and Roth did not know. He knew that the northeast route, which looked promising on first glance, actually led to a series of box canyons that would trap inexperienced climbers. He knew that the water sources in that direction were unreliable. He knew that the high passes looked navigable, but were actually deadly this time of year due to loose scree and sudden weather changes. Dietrich and Roth were going to die if someone did not stop them. Adler looked at his 5 men, saw the same calculation in their eyes. This was their moment. Not the planned escape on the 30th, but right now. The guards were scattered. The chaos of the search would provide cover. They could simply walk away in a different direction while everyone else looked for Dietrich and Roth. But if they did, that 2 men would die. Werner Brandt spoke quietly in German. "This is our chance. Right now." Oskar Schilling nodded slowly. "We could be 5 miles away before anyone noticed." Emil and Jakob Hartmann said nothing, but their eyes asked the question. Adler looked at Reinhardt, who had no stake in the escape plan, who had never been strong enough to be included. The young man's face showed only concern for the 2 prisoners who had run. "If we help them search," Adler said in German, "we are choosing to stay." Bergman, the forester, spoke with the weight of someone who understood forests and their dangers. "And if we do not help, Dietrich and Roth will die. We know the mountains, the Americans do not. Without us, those 2 men have no chance." The silence stretched. Then Adler turned to Captain Sullivan and spoke in careful English. "Dietrich will go high, to ridges. He thinks high ground is safe, but there are canyons to northeast, box canyons. They will trap him." Sullivan studied Adler's face. The captain was not stupid. He understood exactly what this offer of help meant, what it cost. "Can you lead us to them?" "I think yes, but we must go now." "Before dark." Sullivan made his decision in seconds. "Get your gear. You 3 Bergman and the Hartmann brothers come with me. Wade, you are with us. Davis, you hold the camp." They moved out quickly, Adler leading the way with Bergman beside him. The Hartmann brothers followed, then Sullivan and Wade with Brandt, Schilling and Reinhardt bringing up the rear. Adler set a hard pace, reading the forest signs, following the route he himself had planned to take in 2 days. Every step was familiar. Every landmark was one he had memorized for his own escape. And now he was using that knowledge to prevent someone else's escape. The irony was not lost on him. They found Dietrich and Roth 3 hours later, just as the sun was setting. The 2 men were exactly where Adler had predicted, trapped at the head of a box canyon with cliffs on 3 sides and no way forward. They were soaked from crossing a stream. They had no fire. The temperature was dropping fast. Roth had twisted his ankle badly and could barely walk. When Dietrich saw Adler, his face twisted with rage and betrayal. He shouted in German, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Traitor, coward! You should have come with us. You should have run when you had the chance." Adler walked up to him calmly and spoke quietly so the Americans could not hear. "If we had run, we would be exactly where you are now. Trapped, injured, dying. There is no honor in stupid death, Otto. Only stupidity. Better to die free than live as a slave. We are not slaves. We are prisoners being fed better than we ate in service, treated with more respect than many of us got from our own officers. Is that slavery? Or is that something else you are too blinded by ideology to see?" Dietrich spat at his feet. Sullivan stepped between them. "Enough. We are taking you both back. You can be angry about it or grateful for it, but either way, you are coming back." The return journey took 4 hours because of Roth's injury. They had to fashion a rough stretcher from pine branches and carry him. Adler and Emil took the first shift, their mountain strength proving useful. Wade and Jakob took the second. Even Reinhardt, still underweight, but much stronger than 7 weeks ago, took a turn helping to carry the stretcher. They reached camp near midnight. Dr. Blackwell treated Roth's ankle. Dietrich and Roth were placed under closer supervision, though Sullivan did not order any formal punishment. As the group dispersed to their barracks, Sullivan stopped Adler with a hand on his shoulder. "You could have run today," the captain said quietly. "You knew exactly where we were going and how to disappear, but you chose to help instead. Why?" Adler considered his answer carefully. "Because letting men die when you can save them is not honor. It is just cruelty." Sullivan nodded slowly. "Get some sleep, and thank you." That night, August 28th, Wilhelm Adler gathered his 5 men in the barracks after the evening count. The supplies he had buried in the forest for the escape were still there untouched. The new moon was 2 days away. The plan was still viable, but he knew and they knew that something had fundamentally changed. "I am going to tell you," Adler said quietly, "why we are not escaping in 2 days." They listened in silence as he laid out his reasoning. They had helped the Americans rescue Dietrich and Roth. That meant they had betrayed their own escape plan, their own best opportunity. Why had they done that? Because letting 2 men die felt wrong, even if those men were idiots. But that single choice revealed something larger. It revealed that they had begun to think of right and wrong in terms that transcended simple national loyalty, that they had begun to make decisions based on what felt human rather than what ideology demanded. Werner Brandt spoke next, his economics training making him focus on the larger patterns. "I studied American industrial capacity before the war," he said. "The numbers seemed impossible. Annual steel production of 80 million tons, aluminum production of 1 million tons, tank production of 2,000 per month, aircraft production of 8,000 per month. The professors told us these were propaganda figures, exaggerations designed to demoralize us." He gestured around the barracks at the camp beyond. "But everything we have experienced here confirms those numbers were real, possibly even conservative. The equipment that gets replaced without hesitation, the food that flows in steady supply, the casual abundance that is not carelessness but simply reality." He leaned forward. "If America can treat prisoners this well, while fighting a 2-front war, while supplying Britain and Russia, while building an invasion fleet, while conducting strategic bombing campaigns, what does that tell us about which side is actually winning?" Franz Bergmann, the forester, added his own observation. "The selective logging, the forest management, the replanting we have seen. Captain Sullivan plans for these forests to be here 50 years from now, 100 years from now. That is not the thinking of a nation desperately trying to survive. That is the thinking of a nation that has already won and is planning for what comes after." Oscar Schilling, the farm boy who could read the sky, said simply, "Everything they told us was lies. The Americans are not weak. They are not soft. They are not losing. We were lied to about everything." The Hartman brothers looked at each other with the silent communication of siblings who have shared everything. Finally, Emil spoke. "Captain Sullivan risked injury to save me from the Widowmaker. He did not hesitate, did not calculate whether it was worth it. He just acted. What kind of nation produces officers who value enemy prisoners that much?" Jacob added. "And we just spent 8 hours helping Americans rescue 2 Germans who called us traitors. What does that make us?" They all looked at Lucas Reinhardt, who had never been part of the escape plan, but whose presence among them had become essential anyway. Reinhardt spoke slowly, his voice carrying the weight of the question he had been living with for 7 weeks. "On July 7th, I weighed 94 pounds. I was dying. Dr. Blackwell has weighed me every single day since then. 94, 98, 105, 112, 118, and this morning, 124 pounds. 30 pounds in 7 weeks. He pulled out the small notebook that Blackwell had started giving him, where the daily weights were recorded. "He cares whether I live or die, not because he has to, not because it serves some strategic purpose, but because he is a doctor, and I am a patient, and that is what doctors do." Reinhardt's voice cracked slightly. "My mother in Hamburg weighs, I do not know, maybe less than I weighed in July. She eats 1,200 calories if the ration cards work. I eat 3,200 calories of bacon and eggs and bread. I am healthy and she is starving." He looked around at the 5 men who had become something like friends despite everything. If I escape and die in the mountains, what does that mean? That I threw away the life Dr. Blackwell saved because some ideology told me I should hate Americans, that I wasted £30 that could have gone to someone else? His question hung in the air. Then he asked the harder one. Or do we stay? Do we work? Do we try to deserve this second chance we have been given? Wilhelm Adler, who had spent his adult life in mountains, who understood survival and risk better than most men, spoke with the finality of a judge rendering verdict. We stay, not because we are surrendering, not because we are betraying Germany, but because we are choosing reality over propaganda. We are choosing to see that the people feeding us and saving us are not demons. They are men, flawed men fighting in a terrible war, but men, nonetheless, who have chosen to be kind when they could have chosen to be cruel. He looked at each of his 5 companions. All in favor. 5 hands rose, unanimous. Adler stood and walked to his bunk. From beneath his mattress, he pulled out a small wrapped bundle. The supplies for the escape. Matches, dried food, the compass, the knife. Tomorrow, he said, I will bury these so deep in the forest that they will never be found. And we will go back to cutting timber and learning forestry and living like men instead of dying like fools. They sat together in silence as the night deepened around them. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood eternal and indifferent. Inside, 6 German prisoners had made a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They had chosen to stay. And in that choice, they had chosen to become something other than what the war had tried to make them. The morning after their decision, Captain Sullivan noticed a change in the 6 men's demeanor. They worked with a different quality of attention, asking more questions about technique, taking genuine pride in the precision of their cuts. He said nothing, but he exchanged a glance with Sergeant Wade that suggested both men understood something fundamental had shifted. Over the following weeks, the transformation deepened. Wilhelm Adler began discussing forest management strategies with Sullivan through Sergeant Weber's translation, contributing ideas based on his years of experience in Bavarian timber country. Franz Bergmann studied the replanting protocols with the intensity of someone who planned to use this knowledge someday, perhaps teach it to his son when he returned home. Werner Brandt calculated board feet and growth rates and sustainability ratios with the enthusiasm he had once reserved for economic theory. The Hartmann brothers, Emil and Jakob, discovered they had a talent for the dangerous work of felling large trees on steep slopes. They moved with the confidence of men who had grown up in mountains and understood how rock and timber and gravity interacted. And Lucas Reinhardt continued his daily weigh-ins with Dr. Blackwell, watching the numbers climb with feelings that remained complicated, but were slowly shifting from guilt towards something else. Something that might eventually become acceptance. By late September, Reinhardt weighed 132 pounds. 38 pounds gained in 11 weeks. His face had filled out. His ribs no longer showed through his skin. He could hike for hours without needing rest. His cough had vanished entirely. You are healthy, Dr. Blackwell told him during one morning weigh-in. Properly, genuinely healthy. Whatever damage the malnutrition did your body has repaired it. You are a normal 19-year-old man now. Reinhardt looked at the weight chart at the careful progression of numbers that tracked his return from death. Thank you, Doctor. You did the work. I just provided the bacon. Blackwell smiled. Though I am curious, how do you feel about it now? The weight gain. Reinhardt considered the question carefully. I still think about my family, about whether they have food, but Sergeant Wade told me something in the storm cabin. He said I have to decide what I do with my survival, whether I waste it feeling guilty or use it to build something better. Wade is a wise man. Yes, sir, he is. As autumn came to the Colorado mountains, painting the aspens gold and bringing cold nights that hinted at the winter to come, the logging operation continued. The prisoners had become genuinely skilled at their work. Production rates increased not because of pressure, but because of competence and something approaching professional pride. Captain Sullivan began involving them in planning decisions. which areas to log next, how to handle specific terrain challenges, where to focus replanting efforts when spring came. Werner Brandt became an informal liaison, his improving English allowing for more direct communication between the American staff and the German prisoners. In October, new prisoners arrived from other camps, men who had been held in facilities where conditions were far harsher. They arrived suspicious, defensive, expecting cruelty. Brandt found himself explaining to them what made this place different. "The Americans here are not soft," he would say in German. "They are confident enough to be humane. There is a difference. Softness comes from weakness. This comes from strength." On the evening of December 24th, 1944, the camp prepared for Christmas. It would be the prisoners' first Christmas in captivity, and for many of them their first Christmas away from home in their lives. Sergeant Wade and Captain Sullivan had been planning this for weeks. They understood that for men far from home, far from everything familiar, the holidays could be breaking points or healing moments, depending on how they were handled. The mess hall had been decorated. Franz Bergmann had selected a perfect spruce from the forest, a 12-foot tree with symmetrical branches and dense needles. It stood in the corner decorated with simple ornaments that the camp staff had contributed from their own supplies. As the prisoners filed in for dinner, they found tables set with more care than usual, real plates instead of metal trays, cloth napkins, candles, and the food. The cooks had been preparing for days. What they had created was not a meal. It was a statement, a declaration that even in war, even in captivity, some traditions of human decency could be maintained. The centerpiece was a turkey. Not a small turkey, but a massive bird, nearly 30 pounds, that had been roasting since dawn. Its skin was golden brown and crackling, glistening with fat that had basted it from the inside out. When the head cook carried it out on a huge platter, the smell that filled the room was overwhelming. Sage and thyme and butter and the deep, satisfying aroma of perfectly cooked poultry. He carved it at a side table with theatrical flourish, the knife slicing through meat that was so tender it fell away from the bone in thick, juicy slices. Steam rose from each cut, carrying with it the scent of everything good about abundance and feast and celebration. The turkey was accompanied by side dishes that arrived in waves. Mashed potatoes came in enormous bowls, the potatoes whipped to an impossible smoothness with what must have been pounds of real butter and heavy cream. They were white and fluffy as clouds, with pools of melted butter glistening on top. Each spoonful was rich and creamy, coating the mouth with fat and salt and the comforting taste of pure starch. Gravy followed in gravy boats that had been borrowed from somewhere, thick brown gravy made from the turkey drippings, rich and savory and perfect for pouring over everything else on the plate. Green beans had been cooked with bacon. Not a token piece or two, but genuine bacon throughout the strips cut into bite-sized pieces that dotted the vegetables. Each bean carried the smoky, salty, fatty taste of pork, along with the snap of properly cooked vegetables. There was cranberry sauce, tart, and sweet, a burst of brightness that cut through all the richness. There were dinner rolls fresh baked that afternoon, soft inside with a slight crust outside, served warm so that butter melted into them immediately when applied. There was corn, yellow and sweet. There were candied yams with brown sugar and butter. There was stuffing made with bread and sausage and herbs. The portions were not small. The cooks loaded each prisoner's plate with food until it could barely hold more. This was not careful rationing. This was deliberate abundance. Lucas Reinhardt sat before his plate and felt something break inside his chest. He had gained 38 pounds in 5 months. His body was healthy, strong. And here before him was more food than his entire family in Hamburg would see in a week, possibly in a month. He ate slowly, trying to savor it, but also trying not to think about what it meant. The turkey was unbelievably tender, seasoned perfectly, the fat content making each bite rich and satisfying. The potatoes were like eating pure comfort. The bacon in the green beans reminded him of every breakfast for the past 5 months. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some ate with single-minded focus. Others ate slowly, almost reverently. A few wept quietly as they ate, overwhelmed by the contradiction of abundance in captivity of kindness from enemies. Hans Vogel, the older factory worker who had steadied Reinhardt on that first morning, leaned over and whispered in German, "I fought in the last war, in the trenches in France. I have seen terrible things, but I have never seen anything as strange as this. Enemies feeding us like we are honored guests." Reinhardt could only nod. But the meal was not finished. After the main course, after the plates had been cleared and the prisoners sat in stuffed contentment thinking surely that was all, the cooks brought out dessert. 3 different pies. The first was apple pie. The crust was flaky and golden, shattering at the touch of a fork. Inside, the apples had been cooked down to tenderness, but still maintained their structure, seasoned with cinnamon and nutmeg and a touch of lemon that brightened the sweetness. It was served warm, and when the fork broke through the crust, steam rose carrying the scent of autumn orchards and harvest time. The second was pumpkin pie. Smooth and creamy, spiced with nutmeg and ginger and cloves, it had the texture of custard and the taste of holidays and home. It was topped with real whipped cream, not the shelf-stable substitute, but actual cream whipped with sugar until it formed soft peaks that melted on the tongue. The third was pecan pie. The filling was sticky sweet like candy, studded with toasted pecans that added crunch and a slightly bitter counterpoint to the overwhelming sweetness. The crust was buttery and rich. Each prisoner received a slice of all 3 pies. Reinhardt stared at his dessert plate. 3 pieces of pie. Dessert. Food beyond the meal. Food for pleasure rather than survival. He took a bite of the apple pie, and the taste transported him instantly to his grandmother's kitchen in Hamburg, to Christmas mornings before the war, when the world had been normal and safe and full of simple joys like cinnamon and sugar. He managed 3 bites before he had to excuse himself. Outside, the December night was cold and clear. The stars above the Colorado mountains shone with a brilliance impossible in cities. Reinhardt walked away from the mess hall into the darkness and let himself feel everything he had been holding back. Sergeant Wade found him there, standing in the snow, tears freezing on his face. Wade did not say anything at first, just stood beside the young man and looked up at the same stars. Finally, Reinhardt spoke, his voice rough. "Sergeant Wade, I just ate 3 pieces of pie. 3. Dessert. Extra food beyond the meal. And my mother, if she is alive, she is eating potato peels, maybe grass. My father, he is thin from starvation. My sister Anna, she is 15 years old and probably weighs less than I weighed when I arrived here. I know, son. How do I deserve this? How can I sit at that table and eat turkey and pie when they suffer?" Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You remember what I told you in the cabin about choices? You said I have to decide what I do with my survival." "That's right. You can't control what happens in Hamburg. You can't control whether your family has food or not. That is beyond your power. The only thing you can control is what you do with the life you've been given." Wade turned to face Reinhardt directly. "You think your mother would want you to starve yourself in guilt? You think your father would want you to refuse food and die? No. They would want you alive. They would want you to eat and be strong and survive and come home to them when this war ends. But I feel like I am betraying them every time I eat." "I know, but that feeling is not truth. That is just war trying to make you hate yourself for surviving. Do not give it that power." They stood in silence for a while longer. Then Wade said something that would stay with Reinhardt forever. "My son Thomas, he is training to drop bombs on Germany right now, learning to drop explosives on cities where people like your family live. And every day I teach you English. Every day I make sure you are safe and fed and healthy. What does that make me, a traitor to my own son, or just a man trying to hold on to his humanity in a war that wants to strip it away?" Reinhardt had no answer. "We are all carrying contradictions," Wade said. "All carrying guilt for things we cannot control. The only way through it is to live well enough to honor everyone who did not make it. You understand?" "I think so, sir." "Good. Now get back inside before you freeze, and eat your damn pie. Your grandmother's recipe would be insulted if you wasted it." Reinhardt almost laughed despite everything. He returned to the mess hall and finished his dessert. That night, the Americans and Germans sang Christmas carols together. Sergeant Wade led them, his voice rough but earnest in the traditional songs that transcended borders. Silent Night, O Come All Ye Faithful, songs that German mothers and American mothers both sang to their children. Songs that spoke of peace on earth and goodwill toward men, sentiments that seemed impossibly distant in December of 1944, but were no less true for being distant. Captain Sullivan listened from the doorway. If there were tears on his face, no one mentioned them. The new year came. January 1945 brought snow that measured in feet rather than inches, temporarily slowing the logging operation but not stopping it entirely. The prisoners had become genuinely skilled at winter work, understanding how to move safely in deep snow, how to fell trees in frozen conditions, how to maintain equipment in extreme cold. In March, news began filtering through about the war's progress. The German forces were in retreat on all fronts. Cities were falling. Territory was being lost. The prisoners received this information with complex emotions, grief for their homeland, concern for families, but also a strange kind of relief that the conflict which had seemed eternal was actually approaching its end. On May 8, 1945, the camp gathered to hear the official announcement. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Sergeant Weber translated the formal statement, his voice neutral and professional, despite the weight of what he was saying. The prisoners stood in silence, absorbing the reality of complete and total defeat. Captain Sullivan addressed them through Weber's translation. The work will continue. Timber is still needed for reconstruction efforts. You will remain here, continuing your labor until repatriation can be organized. The process will take months, perhaps until the end of the year. He paused, then said something that was not in any official script. I want to thank you, not because you were required to work. Prisoners can do minimum effort and still technically comply with regulations, but you chose to work well. You learned skills. You contributed genuine value. You maintained your dignity even in defeat. That means something. It will mean something when you return home and help rebuild what has been lost. The logging continued through that summer and into the fall. By November, they had processed thousands of board feet of timber, replanted acres of forest, and built infrastructure that would serve the Forest Service for decades to come. More importantly, they had learned something about themselves and about their former enemies that would shape the rest of their lives. In late November, the first repatriation orders came through. The prisoners would be leaving in groups processed through camps on the East Coast before being shipped back to Germany. Werner Brandt was among the first to go. On his last day, Captain Sullivan gave him a book on American forestry practices inscribed with a simple note, "For rebuilding European forests and European futures." Brandt shook Sullivan's hand, his English now fluent enough to say, "Captain, you taught me that strength has many forms. I will teach this truth in Germany." The Hartmann brothers left in early December. Sergeant Wade walked them to the trucks, shook their hands, told them to stay safe and build something good. Emil embraced Wade briefly. "You saved my life twice, Sergeant. Once from the Widowmaker, once from the ideology that would have killed me in these mountains. I will not forget." On December 15th, the final group departed. Wilhelm Adler, Franz Bergmann, Oskar Schilling, and Lukas Reinhardt. The morning of departure, Reinhardt reported to Dr. Blackwell's clinic one final time for a last weigh-in. He stepped on the scale and watched the needle settle at 136 pounds. Blackwell recorded it in the ledger, then tore out the page with all of Reinhardt's daily weights from July 7th through December 15th. He folded it carefully and handed it to the young man. "This is yours. It is a record of your survival, of your body's will to live. Keep it. Remember it when things get hard." Reinhardt looked at the page. 94 pounds to 136 pounds. 42 pounds gained in 23 weeks. "Thank you, Doctor, for everything. You did the work. I just provided the conditions." Blackwell shook his hand firmly. "Go home. Find your family. Live a good life. That is my prescription." At the trucks, Sergeant Wade was waiting. He handed Reinhardt a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a forestry book, a photograph of Wade's family with Thomas circled in pencil, and a sealed envelope marked, "Open when you get home." "You were 94 pounds when you arrived," Wade said, his voice thick with emotion. "Looked like a skeleton. Now you are a healthy young man. That is not something to feel guilty about. That is proof you are strong enough to survive hell." Reinhardt could not speak. He simply embraced the older man and wept. Wade held him for a moment, then stepped back. "You go home. You find your family. If they are alive, you tell them they raised a good son. If they are gone, you live well enough for all of them. That is an order, Private Reinhardt. You copy?" "Yes, Sergeant. I copy." Captain Sullivan shook each man's hand as they boarded the trucks. To Adler he said, "You made the right choice that night. Takes more courage to stay than to run." The trucks carried them down the mountain roads they had climbed 18 months earlier. The prisoners looked back at the valley, at the forests they had logged and replanted, at the camp where they had been transformed from enemies into something more complicated. The journey home was long and bureaucratic. Processing camps, transit camps, weeks of waiting and paperwork. They reached Germany in February 1946, landing at Bremen and making their way through a country that barely resembled the one they had left. Cities were ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of people were displaced, searching for family members, trying to rebuild lives from nothing. Reinhardt made his way to Hamburg in March. The city was devastated, whole districts reduced to rubble. 60% destroyed from years of bombing raids. He searched for weeks, checked refugee lists, survivor registries, aid stations, asked everyone he met if they knew his family name. In late April, he found an official from the Red Cross who had records. The man checked his lists and delivered the news with practiced gentleness. Heinrich Reinhardt, Lucas's father, had been killed in a bombing raid on March 3, 1945. He had been clearing rubble when a delayed action bomb detonated. Margareta Reinhardt, his mother, had died on April 8, 1945, in a refugee shelter. Pneumonia exacerbated by malnutrition. Her weakened body could not fight the infection. Both dead before Germany had even surrendered. Both dead before Lucas's letter of February 1945 could have reached them. The Red Cross official gave him one piece of good news. His sister Anna had survived. She was living with an aunt in the countryside about 50 miles from Hamburg. Reinhardt made the journey on foot, carrying everything he owned in a small rucksack. When he reached the farmhouse where Anna was staying, he stood outside for several minutes trying to gather himself. Finally, he knocked. The girl who answered was 17 now, though she looked younger because of her thinness. She weighed perhaps 81 pounds on a frame that should have carried 115. Her face was gaunt, her eyes too large, her body showing all the signs of prolonged malnutrition that Reinhardt recognized from mirrors. She stared at him for several seconds, not recognizing him. Then her eyes widened.
"Lucas, you are so healthy, so big."
He had not thought about how he would look to her. A healthy young man of 136 pounds standing before a starving girl who remembered him as a half-starved conscript. "Anna," he said, and then could say nothing else because he was weeping. They held each other in the doorway while their aunt watched from inside. Eventually they moved to the kitchen table, and Anna made weak tea from herbs because real tea was unavailable. Lucas told her about Colorado, about the camp, about weighing 94 pounds and being saved by an American doctor and a sergeant who had lost his own son, about gaining 42 pounds while their parents starved. Anna listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Mother's last words to me," she said quietly, "were, 'Thank God the Americans have Lucas. At least one of us survives. She died grateful you were safe. She wanted you to live.'" Reinhardt felt something inside him break and reform simultaneously. That night, alone in the small room the aunt had given him, he opened the sealed envelope from Sergeant Wade. Inside was a letter written in careful, deliberate handwriting. The letter told him about Thomas Wade's death. His plane had gone down over Hamburg on March 17, 1945. He had been 19 years old bombing the city Lucas was from possibly killing people Lucas knew. Wade wrote about the impossible contradictions of war, about feeding an enemy prisoner while his son flew missions to destroy that prisoner's home, about how war made everyone guilty, and the only question was what you did with that guilt afterward. The letter ended with specific instructions. Live well. Use the survival. Don't waste it on guilt. Build something better than what came before. Honor everyone who did not make it by living fully enough for all of them. And a final note. If you ever make it back to Montana, there is land here. Work here. You have skills we need. Think about it. Reinhardt kept that letter for the rest of his life. The years that followed were hard. Germany was broken and occupied, divided between East and West. Food remained scarce through 1947. Anna married in 1952 and emigrated to America with her husband's family, who had relatives in Montana. She wrote to Lucas telling him that Sergeant Wade had helped arrange sponsorship papers, that there was forestry work waiting for him. But Reinhardt could not leave. His parents were buried in Hamburg. He owed them something, though he was never sure exactly what. His presence, perhaps. His witness to what had happened. He never married, never had children. He lived alone in a small apartment and worked his way up to become a forestry supervisor for the Hamburg region. He applied the techniques Captain Sullivan had taught him, selective logging and sustainability thinking, always planning for forests that would outlive him. He never credited the Americans publicly. The Cold War made such things complicated. But he used their methods quietly, and the forests he managed thrived. Through the decades, his weight remained stable at 132 to 136 pounds. A healthy weight, the weight of survival. In 2001, Clayton Wade died at the age of 107. The obituary mentioned his service in 2 world wars, his work with prisoners of war, his kindness to people who had every reason to hate him. When Reinhardt read the obituary in an international newspaper, he did something he had never done before. He flew to Montana for the funeral. He met Matthew Wade, now 80 years old, Clayton's middle son, who had survived the war in Europe. Matthew embraced him like family. "Dad talked about you his whole life," Matthew said. "The German kid at 94 pounds who ate bacon like he'd never seen food. He wondered until the end if you made it, if you were okay." They visited Clayton Wade's grave together. The headstone was simple. Clayton Wade, 1894 to 2001. Loved well. Reinhardt stood before it and whispered, "I made it, Sergeant. 56 years past that mountain. I never forgot." He returned to Hamburg and lived another year. In March 2002, at the age of 76, Lucas Reinhardt died of heart failure. Anna inherited his few possessions. Among them, she found Wade's letter read so many times the paper was crumbling. The weight chart from Dr. Blackwell preserved in plastic. The photograph of Wade's family with Thomas circled in pencil. And a journal with a final entry dated February 2002. In it, Reinhardt had written his last thoughts about the 42 pounds he gained in Colorado, about the 56 years he spent asking whether he deserved them, about the life he built, trying to answer that question. The entry ended with words that Anna would remember for the rest of her life. "Sergeant Wade told me to live well enough for everyone who did not make it. I have tried. I planted 15,000 trees. I taught 300 foresters. I helped rebuild forests that bombs destroyed. But I never married, never had children, never allowed myself full happiness, because how could I when they suffered while I ate pie? If I see Wade again in whatever comes after, I will ask, did I do enough? Was I worthy of those 42 pounds? I think I know his answer. He would say I was still asking the wrong question. It was never about deserving. It was about surviving and using that survival well. Perhaps he was right. I will know soon." Anna donated the journal, the weight chart, and Wade's letter to the German-American Reconciliation Museum in Berlin.
They became part of an exhibit about the prisoner of war experience, about the complicated humanity that could exist even in the midst of total war. The exhibit was titled 94 Pounds, the Weight of Survival. The final panel read, Lucas Reinhardt gained 42 pounds in the mountains of Colorado in 1944 and 1945.
He spent 56 years asking if he deserved them. Perhaps the answer is this. He survived. He worked well. He helped rebuild. And he never forgot the people who chose kindness when they could have chosen cruelty. The weight was never the question. The living well was always the answer. In Montana, Clayton Wade's gravestone stands weathered by decades of mountain weather. Occasionally tourists visit, drawn by the Berlin exhibit, wanting to see where the man who saved a 19-year-old enemy was laid to rest. The forests that Lucas Reinhardt and 5 other German prisoners logged in 1944 and 1945 have regrown according to Captain Sullivan's careful plans. They stand healthy and sustainable, providing timber and habitat and beauty for a world that moved beyond the war. And somewhere deep in those Colorado mountains, buried where no one will ever find it, lies a small cache, a compass, a knife, dried food, and a dream of freedom that 6 men traded for something more valuable. The choice to stay. The choice to see enemies as human beings. The choice to build rather than destroy. That choice, more than any battle or treaty, was what saved them all.